Documents Volume 3 contains so many of these early powerful experiences that happened to members of the church, early foundational revelations, experiences that run the gambit of emotions in 1833 to early 1834.
It covers the months from February of 1833 through March of 1834, and in those 14 months you really see through the unfolding of the documents in the volume Joseph Smith's thought processes on things like the house of the Lord, theology, quite a bit of revelation that Joseph Smith receives.
The collective volumes of the Joseph Smith Papers are the documents and original source materials from the life and ministry of the prophet Joseph Smith. These records are vital. They're the source of much of the early history of the Latter-day Saints. Now, as pertaining to Documents Volume 3, what happened of consequence between February 1833 and March of 1834? Well, actually, quite a bit. This special History of the Saints presentation opens up Documents Volume 3 and gives just a glimpse of what's coming in this landmark volume.
In Documents Volume 3, we have the first efforts of the church's presidency to begin construction on the house of the Lord. In a revelation given in December of 32, the council is given to build a house of the Lord. And the revelation states that church members must establish an house, even an house of prayer, and house of fasting, and house of faith, and house of learning, and house of glory, and house of order, and house of God. And they're to do that in Kirtland. But from that revelation in December 1832 until June 1st, 1833, not much progress is made in establishing this house that church members have been commanded to. And there's another revelation given, Section 95 of the Doctrine and Covenants says that church members have sinned a very grievous sin against the Lord because they haven't done that thing which was commanded of them, which was to begin to build the house. Shortly after the revelation, two committees are established. One is a planning committee, and Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, and Frederick G. Williams are chosen to be the planning committee for building the house of the Lord. And another committee, the building committee, is established to carry out the plans and to actually build the house of the Lord, or to oversee the building of the house of the Lord. And the three in that committee are Hyrum Smith, Reynolds Cahoon, and Jared Carter. So shortly after the revelation is received on June 1st, in which they're given only dimension, like the size of the house is given in that revelation, the three on the planning committee are encircled in prayer, and during this time a vision appears to them.
We went upon our knees, called on the Lord, and the building appeared within viewing distance. I being the first to discover it, then all of us viewed it together. After we had taken a good look at the exterior, the building seemed to come right over us, and the makeup of this hall seemed to coincide with what I there saw to a minutia.
And so this allowed them to go to the drawing board, so to speak, and to draw the plan for the house of the Lord. And they draw the plans for both the Kirtland house of the Lord and for the ones to be built in Independence. On the 6th of June, there's a conference of high priests that meet in Kirtland, and they are told to begin construction on the building. And Hyrum Smith records in his diary the next day, June 7th, that is when they began to clear the ground and to start digging the trenches for the walls of the house of the Lord.
With the command to begin building the house of the Lord, the men were eager to get started, particularly Hiram, who was twice as much animated as the rest of the men, as though he were building the house for himself. He declared that he would strike the first blow, and strike it he did. He took a scythe, went out onto the designated lot, and cut down a field of standing green wheat to make way for the temple.
One of the neat things about Documents 3 is the treatment of the word of wisdom. That revelation is received in February of 1833. It's one of the things that even people who know very little about Mormonism, about the Latter-day Saints, most people have an understanding or a sense that we have this health code that proscribes substances that a lot of people think are just, everyday things. In Docs 3, that revelation is presented with the background to it, and then also somewhat a departure from a lot of other documents, but it follows through how that revelation is received, not just in Kirtland, but pretty much through the rest of Joseph Smith's life. And so you see the background to it, what led to it, and then sort of how it evolved within the first few years after its reception. In a way, it grows out of the School of the Prophets, which begins in January of 1833. I think it's a significant point. You've got these men who have met according to Revelation, following section 88. The Lord said, I want you to have this school, and he lays out what it's about. And the whole idea of the School of the Prophets is they're trying to build spirituality, trying to build testimony, trying to clean themselves up so that they really can gain a strong testimony of the gospel, of the Savior, of the work that they're doing. And fairly early on in that process, Joseph receives this revelation. To think that the word of wisdom is just an outgrowth of the larger cultural and social movements that were afoot, I think is to miss the real significance of the word of wisdom. The culture, society was doing it for social reasons, for health reasons. I think fundamentally the word of wisdom is for spiritual reasons. And this School of the Prophets, which is working literally on cleaning themselves up so that they can stand in the presence of God, one of the first things they learn they need to do is get rid of the tea, the coffee, the tobacco, the alcohol, and things like that. Initially, it's a word of wisdom. It's exactly what it says. This is a smart thing to do, but not by commandment. We have accounts when other people tried to hold or make this a stronger requirement than the revelation actually called for. Joseph and Hiram were right there saying, back off a little bit, hold off. We don't want to be too strict. We don't want to make too big of a thing about this right now. And you really do, you see this spectrum of responses. And you see Joseph and Hiram giving clear definitions. Here's what is meant by hot drinks. But as far as enforcing it in some sort of strict puritanical sense, they weren't doing that. They were erring on, I think, the side of leniency and giving people a chance to work through it. And so you see a very patient, merciful God who's willing to give them the 90 years, several generations, to wean themselves from these things that were so deeply rooted in the culture, in the society, in their habits. You just got to be careful that you don't judge what they were doing, including Joseph Smith. He lived the standard at the time. He promoted what the Lord had said. He got it out there and lived it and tried to help other people live it and laid a foundation then that later prophets could build upon and reach the standard that we have today. So the word of wisdom, it's the way we got it, the circumstances leading up to Joseph receiving it, as well as its reception, how it was received by church members, including Joseph, including Hiram. That is all developed very carefully in about 15 or so pages of detailed research in Documents 3.
Speaking of the School of the Prophets, consider what it would have been like in those days to sit at the feet of Joseph Smith the prophet and be taught day after day to literally have the heavens opened. That was, in part, the beginnings of the School of the Prophets in Kirtland.
In early 1833, they established the School of the Prophets. And this was, it's named School of the Prophets, but the idea of it is to help the elders who are going to be going out on missions to know their own doctrine better. And one of the more powerful experiences that's covered in Documents Volume 3 is this shared visionary experience they have. In the March 18th of 1833, there's minutes that are kept at this meeting by Frederick G. Williams. And the minutes record that Joseph essentially promises everyone there that they're going to have a heavenly vision if they're faithful. And this meeting continues.
Zebedee Coltrane was present at that meeting and later left the following account of their experience.
While engaged in silent prayer, kneeling with our hands uplifted, each one praying in silence, no one whispered above his breath. A personage walked through the room from east to west, and Joseph asked if we saw him. I saw him, and I suppose that others did. And Joseph answered, "That is Jesus, the Son of God, our elder brother." Afterwards, Joseph told us to resume our former position in prayer, which we did. Another person came through. He was surrounded as if with a flame of fire. I experienced the sensation that it might destroy the tabernacle, as it was a consuming fire of great brightness. The prophet Joseph said that this was the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. I saw him.
Sometime in 1832 or 33, a man named Dr. Philastus Hurlbut joined the church and came to Kirtland. From there, he was called as a missionary, but was excommunicated for lewd and adulterous conduct.
Why does this matter? Well, there's lots of people that get excommunicated for adultery or things like that in the early church. But Hurlbut matters because he immediately begins a concerted speaking tour effort against the church, where he goes around and for money speaks out against the church. And one of the primary things that he begins to argue is that when he was on his mission in Western Pennsylvania, that he had come across a manuscript, that had heard of this manuscript and come across a manuscript that was in fact the actual origin of the Book of Mormon, claiming that a former one-time preacher by the name of Solomon Spaulding had written a novel, and that novel was the basis of the Book of Mormon, and that all that had happened is that Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith had taken it and rewritten it as the Book of Mormon. And so he begins broadcasting these things.
Hurlbut is then hired by anti-Mormons there in Ohio to go to New York and Pennsylvania and gather affidavits on Joseph, his family, and the beginnings of the church.
It shouldn't be terribly surprising then that when Hurlbut comes back, what he submits is antagonistic affidavits about the church, because that's what he was being paid to do. These affidavits make all kinds of accusations against Joseph Smith, the family, arguments about where the Book of Mormon's origins come from, and they become the basis of anti-Mormon, early anti-Mormon rhetoric about Joseph Smith and his family well on into our current era. I mean, probably 20 to 30% of the anti-Joseph Smith, anti-Mormon, antagonistic claims that are made about Joseph Smith originate from Philastus Hurlbut. These same arguments that were published by Eber Howe in Mormonism Unveiled. They were then published again by John C. Bennett in History of the Saints. They were then published again by Wilhelm Weimettel in the 1880s. They were published again. They simply just kept being published over and over and over again. And they form the basis of many of the claims made against Joseph Smith, even to this day.
Zion was precious to the saints. The Lord had revealed that Jackson County, Missouri was to be the place for the city of Zion. That was intended to be a place of safety, a place of refuge, a place where the Lord Himself would come. But then, unexpectedly, in the fall of 1833, mobs drove the saints off their land and out of the county.
We have a letter that Joseph wrote to Edward Partridge on 10 December 1833, after he had received a communication from Partridge informing him about the expulsion, wondering what the saints were to do. And this letter is really a neat letter because Joseph in it is kind of wrestling with these questions of, Lord, if we were supposed to build up the city of Zion, if you commanded us to do it, why then weren't we protected? Why were we kicked out of Zion?
Now, there are two things of which I am ignorant, and the Lord will not show me, perhaps for a wise purpose in Himself. I mean, in some respects, they are these: why God hath suffered so great calamity to come upon Zion, or what the great moving cause of this great affliction is. These two things, and again, by what means He will return her back to her inheritance with songs of everlasting joy upon her head. These two things, brethren, are in part kept back, that they are not plainly shown unto me. Joseph Smith.
And Joseph says in this letter that when he inquired of the Lord about these questions, he didn't receive an answer. He only heard the Lord telling him, "Be still and know that I am God." So this is on December 10th, 1833. 6 days later, the evening of December 16th and December 17th, 1833, Joseph receives a revelation, and this revelation, which is section 101 in today's Doctrine and Covenants, answers those two questions that Joseph told Edward Partridge the Lord wasn't giving him an answer for. The revelation begins by telling Joseph why the saints were ejected from Jackson County, that there had been transgressions on the part of the saints, they had not been sufficiently holy, they had not been doing what they were supposed to do, and that this in part was a reason why they were kicked out. And the second question, by what means Zion would be redeemed, the revelation answers this by giving a parable. And it's a parable of a nobleman who has a vineyard, and the vineyard is taken from him. And in the parable, the nobleman decides to call one of his servants and have his servants go out and call up the strength of his warriors, who would then go and redeem his vineyard. And so this is kind of where Zion's camp begins in this parable. Joseph doesn't act on this revelation when it's given in December of 1833, but just 2 months later, the saints in Kirtland are visited by Parley P. Pratt and Lyman White, who had come from Missouri. Joseph, after hearing the report from Parley P. Pratt and Lyman White, he stands up and he says, "I will lead a group of saints to Missouri to help the church members there. Who will come with me?" And there's about 30 to 40 individuals who volunteer at that meeting and say, we will go with you.
And Zion's camp was born. From May to June 1834, some 230 individuals marched to Missouri to redeem Zion. But what exactly did that mean? Redeem Zion.
The purpose of Zion's camp wasn't to go into Missouri to take the saints and bring them back into Jackson County. That's what the state militia would do. But the purpose of Zion's camp was to go into Missouri, and once the state militia had been discharged, so after the saints had been returned to their lands in Jackson County and the state militia was discharged, then the members of Zion's camp were to stay in Jackson County and protect the saints from any further mob violence. And I think sometimes we don't necessarily understand that that really was the main goal of Zion's camp. It wasn't to go in to wage war on the citizens of Jackson County or to kind of be this armed contingent leading the saints back to their lands. It was solely to be a protective force for the saints once they had been restored to their lands.
And this is just a sample of what's coming up in Documents Volume 3. The rest of the story about Zion's camp will come in future volumes. Now, there's something to be said about drinking deep from the spring where waters originate pure and not downstream below the animals. Studying church history from the volumes of the Joseph Smith Papers is to get our history from its reliable source, the original documents. And so again, coming this November, Documents Volume 3 of the Joseph Smith Papers. I'm Glenn Rawson, and thank you.